Before starting this video, what kind of person do you think will report the location of the victim's body to the police after committing murder? Sacramento, located in central California, near the confluence of the Sacramento River and the American River. It is the state capital with a strong police force and public security system, but also has a disturbing dark side. Several notorious serial killers have inflicted endless fear and suffering upon the residents of this city. The Golden State Killer Joseph targeted couples in his crimes, deriving twisted pleasure from sexual assault and murder. His modus operandi was extremely brutal. He would tie up the male in the bedroom and then take the female to another room to assault her sexually. During that time, the male could only endure extreme mental torment, while the female suffered abuse. Even those who were not killed by him also had their spirits shattered. The vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, his crimes were more terrible, and what he did was the most primitive horror. After killing people, Richard would drink their blood, eat their internal organs. Police even found human tissues and brains in his refrigerator. However, in addition to Joseph and Richard, Sacramento also had another lesser-known serial killer. He was called the Sacramento Slayer, active between 1986 and 1987, and brutally murdered 7 local women. This man was Morris Solomon Jr., a man from Albany, Georgia. Just like the question at the beginning of the video, for some unknown reason, he suddenly reported to the police the location where he had hidden the body of his victim. On June 18, 1986, Sacramento police received a disturbing call. Someone said that he had smelled the odor of decaying corpse. The person who reported the body was Morris, a handyman who worked near Oak Park. He claimed in the call, while repairing a house, he had smelled a nauseating odor, and as a Vietnam War veteran, he was certain that it was the smell of decaying corpse. However, when the police arrived at the scene, they found the situation to be far more complicated than what Morris had described. The victim was a sex worker named Johnson, who was also a drug user. Her body was tightly bound with ropes, half naked, grotesquely lying in a cupboard. Just 1 month later, on July 20th, another female body was discovered. This time, the corpse was found near a collapsed house. The victim was a 25-year-old woman named Angela, who was also a sex worker and drug user. Her body was bound and wrapped in bedding, clearly having been deliberately concealed. As investigations and confirmations progressed, the police found that both victims seemed to have some connection with Morris, who had reported the discovery of Johnson's body. Her time of death was just a few days before Morris made the report, during which time Morris had been conducting repair work in that house. Although Angela's case initially appeared unrelated to Morris, subsequent investigations revealed that he had once lived in that house. Eliminating all possibilities of coincidence, some police officers believed that Morris might have reported the location of Johnson's body in an attempt to mislead the police, making them think he was a concerned citizen rather than a killer. Given these suspicions, police brought Morris to the interrogation room, and there, his behavior seemed to confirm their suspicions. Firstly, Morris was unable to accurately provide his own identity information, and his statements were riddled with contradictions. However, despite some police officers being convinced that Morris was the killer, without solid evidence, they could not detain or arrest him. They could only take Morris's fingerprints and blood samples. In early 1987, Sacramento was home to 2 serial killers. One of them was Dorothea, who ran a boarding house, specifically catering to the elderly, frail, drug and alcohol addicts, and those with mental health issues who were homeless. These unfortunate individuals became her victims, and their remains were buried in her backyard. Moreover, the reason Morris's serial murders did not attract much attention was that a year after his arrest, Dorothea was also apprehended by the police. As one of the most notorious female serial killers in American history, second only to Eileen, the sensational nature of her case completely overshadowed the serial murders committed by Morris. The other serial killer was Morris, whose crimes had yet to be discovered by the police. On March 19th, in the basement of a house near Oak Park in Sacramento, a female body wrapped in a bedsheet was discovered. Upon identification, the victim was a woman named Maria, who was also a sex worker and drug user. At this point, The police had already realized that a serial killer was active near Oak Park in Sacramento. The three victims shared some disturbing similarities. They were all sex workers and drug users, had been bound in a similar manner, and their remains were found partially naked. These details led the police to conclude that there was only one killer behind these cases. After Maria's body was found, the police once again brought Morris to the interrogation room. There, the man provided some false statements, but his lies were quickly refuted by the police. Eventually, Morris admitted that he had given vague information about his identity because he had 4 outstanding arrest warrants, so he chose to lie in an attempt to evade the police investigation. In reality, since the discovery of the first victim, despite the police's extreme suspicion of Morris, he had cooperated with them. On April 20th of the same year, he agreed to let police search his abandoned car in the area where he lived. But when the police arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed a distinct depression in the soil near the abandoned car, so they grabbed a few shovels and began to dig. As time went on, their efforts were rewarded with a shocking discovery. They found the body of 26-year-old Washington. Unlike the previous victims, she was the only one woman without a prostitution record. Her body was also half naked and tightly bound with ropes. 2 days later, the police discovered 2 more victims behind an aging shack associated with Morris. Linda, 24-year-old, Sheila, 17-year-old, had been dead for about a year. In the following days, the police also found Sharon's body near the burial site of Maria. At that time, there was no direct evidence proving that Morris was the killer. There were no fingerprints or DNA traces. The police and prosecution mainly based their charges on 2 points. First, almost all the victims were found near places where Morris had lived, and some sex workers and other witnesses testified that Morris was the last person the victims had contact with before their deaths. During the trial, Morris's defense attorneys proposed an extensive plan for mitigation of punishment. Over the course of 7 days, they found 18 witnesses to testify, attempting to reveal the complex psychology behind Morris's crimes. Their strategy was to attribute Morris's actions to the abuse he suffered in his childhood, his service in Vietnam, and the effects of cocaine use. 2 forensic clinical psychologists testified that the abuse Morris endured in his childhood led to mental, emotional, and behavioral issues in his adulthood, which had an undeniable connection to his crimes. Despite the efforts of the defense attorneys which led to the dismissal of the murder charge against Morris in the Angela case, he was still convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Later, although his death penalty trial was declared a mistrial, in July 1992, the second jury unanimously voted to sentence Morris to death again. When the details of the case were made public, some of Morris's surviving victims came forward and bravely shared their experiences, allowing people to better understand the brutality of this serial killer. 18-year-old Mary testified that she was stabbed with a knife by Morris on September 19, 1969. Dale testified that Morris kicked her in the face on May 17, 1971. Connie described the nightmare of October 18, 1975, when Morris put a chain around her neck, choked her, assaulted and raped her, and urinated on her face. In addition to these cases, Morris was convicted of felony assault and false imprisonment in 1977. He was also charged with the murder of a masseuse, but was acquitted due to the absence of the prosecution's witness. In 1984, Morris was sentenced in Arizona for 3 counts of grand theft. Ultimately, Morris became the 342nd person sentenced to death in the state and was incarcerated on death row at San Quentin Prison. On July 15, 2010, the California Supreme Court reaffirmed his conviction once again. Only a few people knew that Morris was not only a convicted criminal with a history of sexual assault and brutality, but also had been institutionalized in a state mental hospital, where he was diagnosed as a criminally insane individual. As Morris's defense attorneys argued, Morris's story is one filled with pain and darkness, with his life trajectory largely overshadowed by the shadows of his childhood. On March 15, 1944, Morris was born in a remote rural area of Georgia, where he also spent his childhood. His grandmother, Bertha, took on the responsibility of raising him, but unfortunately, her parenting was characterized by violence. As a child, Morris would often wet the bed, which should have been a normal occurrence for any child, but Bertha used it as an excuse to abuse him. She would place the young Morris across her lap and mercilessly raise her hand, striking him over and over again. Sometimes, a mispronunciation on his part would also become a reason for Bertha to vent her anger. Even Morris's instinctive crying during the abuse was seen by Bertha as a provocation, which only led her to become more violent. Bertha's methods of abuse were cruel and varied. She would order Morris to strip naked, stand on a stool, and then take a wire and lash out at his exposed body, focusing particularly on his genital. Sometimes, Bertha's violent outbursts were without any reason. She would suddenly fly into a rage, tie Morris's hands to the bedpost to prevent him from retreating during the beating. During the first 13 years of Morris's life, he had very little contact with his parents. They seemed like distant strangers, their figures blurred in his memory. It wasn't until the day when Bertha and the family moved to Ileton, a small farming town 40 miles south of Sacramento, that Morris finally reunited with his parents. However, this so-called reunion brought Morris no warmth, but instead plunged him into an even more chaotic and painful world. In Ileton, there was an area known as Cannery Row and Tin Pan Alley. It was impoverished and dilapidated, with run-down houses lining the streets. Morris's family was one of the few African-American families in this small town, and they lived in that very place. In there, Morris witnessed his parents' mutual verbal abuse, physical fights, and even incidents of sexual violence. His mother and grandmother would also beat and berate him in public, with no regard for his feelings. Some relatives described Morris's mother as a promiscuous woman who was aggressive and lacked empathy, and who engaged with different men as a sex worker. Despite the difficult environment in which he grew up, Morris still tried to move forward. After graduating from high school, he entered a community college and attempted various jobs, including carpentry, auto repair, and bus driving. Later, he enlisted in the military. Starting in the summer of 1966, he served in Vietnam for a year during the Vietnam War. In the summer of 1967, he was discharged as a sergeant and returned to Ileton. During this time, Morris had become engaged to a girl he had met before going to Vietnam, but for some reason, the girl broke off the engagement. Later, Morris moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, where he got married and had a daughter. However, due to the impact of both his family life and the war, his mental state became very unstable. After committing some minor offenses, his wife divorced him and took their daughter away. In the end, Morris moved back to Sacramento. There, he found work as a handyman, repairing old houses in exchange for free room and board, and began his career as a killer. In Morris's previous appeal, his lawyers mentioned his experience in Vietnam. They said that during those chaotic times, soldiers could cheaply hook up with Vietnamese women anywhere, even in the battle zone. These young women were also victims of the war. They were treated as objects and toys by soldiers. Like many other soldiers, Morris slowly lost his way in that environment. On August 1st, 2024, at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California, Morris was declared dead. But his death was not a simple natural demise, but rather concealed some inside story. According to insiders from the institution, a death row inmate, William Ramos, had struck Morris on the head with a metal object, causing him to die from blunt force trauma to the back of his head. William, 72 years old, had been sentenced to death for the murder of 3 women. An email revealed more of the inside story, including that on June 26th, Morris had a physical altercation with William and was sent to an external medical facility for emergency care. Morris returned to prison on July 29th and was declared dead on August 1st.